This is the Westminster Standard Podcast. I'm Ryan Beasy. Welcome. We're on something of a summer break this week, but I nonetheless wanted to share with you an episode from the Into the Study podcast, which is the podcast of Independent Presbyterian Church in Savannah, Georgia, with Dr. Terry Johnson and Tim Shaw, where they're discussing the relationship of church and state, of the Christian to the state, and the government to the church and the people of God. Terry Johnson and Tim Shaw discussed some of the implications and what we confess as Presbyterians regarding the role of the magistrate and the church. And so I wanted to share it with you. I hope that we'll be able to get Dr. Johnson on this podcast to discuss these ideas further, but I found it very insightful and encouraging.
Welcome to Into the Study, the podcast from the Independent Presbyterian Church in Savannah, Georgia. I am Tim Shaw, Associate Minister here at IPC, and I'm here with our Senior Minister, Dr. Terry Johnson. Dr. Johnson, at the last General Assembly in Chattanooga in 2025, we not only passed a committee or voted to have a study committee on the directory for worship, public worship, but also a study committee on Christian nationalism. What sense can you make of that? Why would the PCA be interested in studying Christian nationalism?
I think that what inspires the sense that we need this is the kind of cultural chaos that we are in right now. What kind of foundation do you need for a functioning operative society before it descends into pure anarchy and social chaos? What is it that unifies a society? There has to be a consensus about certain things, about what is just and what is unjust, what is right, what is wrong, what is true, what is false. And without that foundation, it becomes just simply a power game that between which a pendulum will swing from anarchy to totalitarianism. So you can have the government flex its muscles and just enforce unity and harmony at the point of a gun, or you can have consensus. That would be the aim in the middle, or you can have anarchy on the left wing. But there has to be some agreed upon principles. And so it's very natural for people to look back, not all that long ago, just have to look back to, say, before 1965. So within my lifetime, before I was 10 years old, we can go back, and there was, by and large, a Christian consensus that goes back to all the way back to Jamestown, to be quite honest about it. At 1611 with Jamestown, or 1609 anyway. It's a long time ago, and then before that, you go back to we were English colonies. You go back to England and Scotland and the British Isles, and you have a Christian consensus that goes back 1,000 years before that. And so there was a glue. There was a consensus about right and wrong. There was a growing consensus about the just and the unjust. And so, you have over time, you have the establishment, the basic rights of human beings. And as well as the Ten Commandments enforcing a moral code, you also have a sense of what rights people have, the rule of law. Henry VIII is pretty arbitrary in his number of his judgments and rulings. Well, you have a gradual, conflict between the monarchy and the Parliament, and there's a civil war, the English Civil War, and Parliament wins that war and establishes limitations upon the monarchy, so that you have now today a constitutional monarchy where the powers of the British monarchs, those are limited. And that's a part of our heritage in the United States. We were British colonies, and so we inherit the sense of the rule of law rather than the rule of men. So law, what is legal and illegal is not just the arbitrary whims of a ruler who is all powerful, but you have instead a society governed by laws that govern, in fact, the people who are ruling. So the rule of law is a fundamental principle behind, and with that there is the sense of human dignity, sanctity of human life, the basic human rights, These are all part of the Christian heritage. So you erode the base. The base of society is going to be this consensus: right and wrong, just and unjust, truth and falsehood. And when that erodes, then what's left? Well, either anarchy to the left or government enforcing tyranny. Yeah, controlled at the point of a gun. Yeah. And so there is a sense in which people are recognizing we would do well to restore the Christian consensus that was foundational to our civilization, given that we were English colonies that go back to 1,500 years ago, and the restoration of that consensus that forms our moral code, forms our judicial system, establishes the rule of law and basic human rights.
For me, the radicalizing moment, or the moment they made me begin to think about this more, was David French arguing that Drag Queen Story Hour was a blessing of our civil liberties, that they have the right to do so because that's free speech and freedom of religion, and we can't tell them not to do that. And thinking how far removed that idea could be from our founding fathers or from our tradition, and how could we possibly be at that place where some of our most elite so-called conservative commentators are making that argument. And what world is that possible? How do we get here? And as you begin to look to a tradition of Protestant social thought, a tradition that, in so many ways, our own confession erupting out of that English Civil War, how to determine just law? What role does special revelation play in natural theology, general revelation? And what way, how do we... What is the church? Does the church guide the king? What's the king's responsibilities to the church or to the government, to the civil magistrate? And for a nation that has no king, how does that all come together? To me, it's a fascinating and confusing and complex story. And as that story unfolds and where we're at now and where we've been in the past, I think it could be a very helpful thing for the PCA to put forth some kind of document, some kind of explanation of what do we believe about the idea of a Christian nation, of Christian nationalism. A couple of years ago, that was thrown around as a major pejorative. If you were a Christian nationalist, that meant you were a white Christian nationalist. That meant you were a kinist or a racist and backwards and patriarchal and non-democratic and authoritarian.
Blood and soil nationalism.
Yes. Which connects you to Hitler, right? Hitler was all about blood and soil. He was a nationalist. And so anybody that thinks the nation is something more than just an idea, or that's kind of the thing I assumed all my life, was that a nation like America is an idea. Well, that's actually a very hard thing to rally around, to bring meaning from, just an idea. And our forefathers in the faith didn't think that.
I think the most important words ever spoken on the subject of the civil government and its relationship to Christians and to the church and religion more generally was when Jesus said, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God the things that are God." And the reason why that's the decisive thing, why that's the most important thing, is because everywhere you go in the world, there has been, and to a sense continues to be, this confusion that Caesar is God. So we famously, the Caesars claim to be divine,
and the pharaohs and the Babylonian kings, they all have a claim on.
They all make divine claims. The Persian kings, and right up into modern times. I mean, the
divine right of kings in some ways.
The Chinese emperor, up until was it 1912 that finally the monarchy in China was overthrown. It was the sun, the sun god, and the Japanese emperor Hirohito.
Right.
I mean, to this day, there are claims of divinity attached to the Japanese emperor.
Well, not to mention North Korean, dictators to this day.
So then you have the secular dictators, but they're also, whether we're talking about Stalin or Pol Pot in Cambodia, they are claiming the powers of life and death. So that there are the claims of divinity are made, even if it's unconventional divinity. And where Jesus' words where they are so decisive is that they are making the distinction between Caesar and God. Caesar is not God. There are the things of God and there are the things of Caesar. And so what the implication of that is, Caesar is not divine. Caesar is not God. In other words, there is a limit to the power of the government. It is a limited government. That is absolutely fundamental to it. a Christian civilization. There are limitations on the government. Now, you go to China today, no limitations on the government. Go to Russia today, no limitations on the government. It's a tyranny. You go to tribal remnants of tribal Africa, and you have the dictators in many of the African countries. Again, no limitations.
There is no law above the king. There is no lex rex in that way.
Right. Rutherford's, famous work, Lex Rex, Law and King, where it was making that very point that the law is king, the king is not king. The law is over the king. The law is, king is accountable to the law. So there are limits. That's the crucial thing. And human history shows that where Christianity has not gone, there is no perception of limits on the power of the government. Eventually, there develops, an all-powerful leader. So that even among the Greeks, famously had developed democratic forms. Well, sort of, because there was a massive number of slaves. So Sparta was sustained by slaves, and even Athenian democracy. There were a limited number of people who were actually citizens. And so, the rights that were, the living reality of an Athenian were limited to, they were not universal, they were limited. And even then, the Greek democracy is succeeded by Alexander the Great, an absolute ruler, who was then succeeded by the Romans. So
Same with the Roman Republic, etc.
Yes, the Roman Republic is not
evolves into an emperor.
Proves not to be sustainable. Unless you have a divine word establishing that the king is not supreme and the king is not divine, which we do have in the Christian faith. We have that in Christianity. Whereas, and so there is a fundamental church-state conflict built into Christianity that you can trace all through the history of Christendom.
Right back to Saul. His kingship is dependent upon his keeping the law of the Lord and his willingness to keep the word of God. And he's removed from that, and even the whole nation is exiled, and the kingship falls in some ways as the kings don't keep the law.
Well, the Middle Ages is in some ways you can say is a history of the conflict between the Pope and the kings.
Yeah.
And so there is, like I say, there is this tension in Western history. Since the conversion of Constantine, as to where exactly civil authority lies, and the tension between the Caesars, the governors, the kings, and the church. Well, that tension, I don't think you find it anywhere else. It's there in Christianity, and sometimes the kings get the upper hand, like Henry VIII. And sometimes the Pope's got the upper hand, or the church got the upper hand. But there's at least a battle going on. There's a tension there. I don't see that there's much tension anywhere else in the world at any other place, any other time in history. So those who want to poo-poo the whole idea of a Christian nationalism, well, it depends on what you mean, and it does depend on that. Nobody wants the church running the state, but do you want the state informed by a Christian consensus and shaped by it? And a Christian consensus shaping what we think is just and unjust, what we think is right and what we think is wrong, what we think should be legal, what should be illegal. Absolutely, by that definition, we're all Christian nationalists. I think we want our government, our country, our nation as a whole to be more rather than less accountable and agreeable and pleasing to God, don't we? And how do we know what that is? Well, we go to the Bible to know what is pleasing to God. And so in the battle of ideas, in a democracy like ours, we want to be in the forefront, battling for the acceptance of the Christian ideals, with which will make life for everyone better than a world which is devolving either into anarchy on the left or into totalitarianism on the right. Mm-hmm. You see this totalitarian impulse in the far left in the United States today. I mean, you could go to the far right, but I think you can fit neo-Nazis into a phone booth. I mean, there are so few of them. But you go to the left, and their willingness to suppress, to seize your children, and indoctrinate them in the schools. Their willingness to impose a completely foreign moral code on the rest of the country. It's a thing to be aware of, that there is this totalitarian impulse on the left that is fright, gaining ground at a frightening rate.
Well, it's a fascinating moment in the sense that it seems like that the Roman Catholics have a social vision, Catholic integralism, and there's a lot of exponents out there. Patrick Deneen out of Notre Dame and his prized students, Pete Hegseth, on one hand from his time at Princeton, and also J.D. Vance, have influence in certain ways in the larger movement. And you also kind of have a Peter Thiel and a Silicon Valley vision of the future, of a social vision that goes that way. And then, of course, you kind of have the leftist omni-cause gay race communism movement that you see, especially right now in New York City mayoral races. The communist Muslim Democratic candidate for the mayor of New York City. There's these different competing visions. What is the Protestant social vision? Do we have one? And as you begin to ask that question, there are many now who are doing a kind of retrieval that seems to have been dormant. Going back and reading our fathers, what they've said, and what the confession says in chapters that to me are fuzzy and unclear. How might you summarize, Terry, what the confession says about church and state relations, and even how that's shifted from the 1640 version to the 1788 version to what we might affirm today?
Well, I think one way in which the Protestant vision is different from the Catholic is I think that there's a democratic impulse in Protestantism that is not necessarily present in Roman Catholicism. I think that once the rights of the congregation are recognized to choose their leaders, as opposed to a top-down hierarchical system that you have in Roman Catholicism, you have a bottom-up system in Protestantism, especially in Reformed Protestantism. So the people are choosing their leaders. Now, their leaders have authority, and they do govern the church. So again, it's not mobocracy. The fear of many of the ancient philosophers and of our founding fathers in this country, the demos, which is the mob, the crowd, ruling without any limitations. That's not what we have. We have that balance. The people choose their leaders. The leaders then have power. That's also the model of our national government. We don't have a pure democracy. Our founding fathers were against that. I think that's part of the Protestant impulse. I think that's the outlook that one has when one sees that it is the right of the people to choose.
It's not naive about human nature.
No, and the fact that it's not naive about the powers of the people who rule. So you want limits. You want limited government. You want limited power. So the people are choosing, but the people don't have all the sovereignty in their own hands. They choose leaders. The leaders then rule. The real rulers are accountable to the people. There's that nuance. There's that balance that's been very, very difficult to achieve historically. So we share a lot in common with Catholic political thought because we're Christians. So we do believe in a limited government. Because Roman Catholicism is a hierarchical system, it's more comfortable with hierarchy than Protestants ever were. And so you go back to the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, and you've got conflict just right out of the box. I mean, there's the conflict between the Dutch Reformed and the Spanish monarchy. That was the Spanish Netherlands back at the time of the Reformation. And so the Duke of Alva is going up there and slaughtering Protestants in what was part of the, Belgium and Holland were all a single part of the Spanish Netherlands. Well, they just basically martyred, and it killed nearly everyone in Holland. But what's present day, in Belgium, but in present day Holland, the Dutch were able to succeed, and so they preserved Protestantism. But my point is that you have this conflict everywhere Protestant has been established. So the Dutch against the Spanish monarchy, the French, the Huguenots against the French monarchy, the Protestants
and the Scots against the English monarchy.
Well, yes, against both the Protestants both in England and in Scotland, Wales, what's today the United Kingdom. There is a conflict with the Stuart monarchs from the very beginning. I mean, with Henry VIII, and then relief under Edward I, but then Bloody Mary's the Tudor monarch. Then you have Elizabeth, but then there's conflict with Elizabeth, and eventually that erupts into civil war because the Parliament is dominated by who? By Reformed Protestants, who are insisting on some basic human rights and the limitations of the what is by then the Stuart monarchy and the powers of James I and Charles I and Charles II. So it's a Protestant social vision understands the necessity of the rule of law. It understands limitations on the power of the government and limitations on the power of the people. It's very nuanced, but I think it's absolutely crucial. And I would say, I mean, I don't ever use the language of Christian nationalists. I just say, as Christians, we want to inform our society about these concepts of basic human rights, about the rule of law, about the limitations of government and the proper role of government. And when we see the growth of the power of the government, we should be alarmed by it. Or if we see growing power of the mob, we should be alarmed by it. You know, in some ways, the whole COVID crisis was eye-opening because the government seized a lot of power during that time, and there was very little pushback from the people. Everybody we just fell into line. We were like sheep, and the ability of the government to manipulate the population in the way that it did, it, apart from any kind of scientific basis for doing so, at many points. Just a reminder that the vulnerability of a properly balanced Republican small r form of government that we enjoy in this country, it's a very difficult thing to sustain. And where there's the erosion of the moral basis upon which you decide what's just and what's unjust. Think of the rights of parents, the erosion of the rights of parents envisioned in the last 5 years. That we're getting pushback now, thankfully. But the erosion of the rights of parents to determine what their children are going to be taught, to determine whether or not they will even be informed if their children are same-sex attracted, if their children are confused about their gender, sexual idea, whether they're male or female. Schools hiding that. Public schools thinking they have the right to hide that from parents, completely undermining the authority of parents. Is that right or is that wrong? Is that just or is that unjust? I think we want Christianity informing that discussion. And something that, it's not like that's an intrusion of religion. There's a secular religion. They're making absolute claims. And so just because they don't invoke the name of a god doesn't mean that they're not claiming universal principles of justice and injustice that they are imposing upon everyone else. So in the marketplace of ideas, we have a role, we have a place.
Are you an establishmentarian? Do you think the church should have we should have some kind of established understanding of a Christian church that undergirds our nation?
No. I don't think there should be a national church. I think we mentioned last time 11 out of 13 colonies had state churches at the time.
Had established churches.
And established
and even, you had to be a member of the church to hold office in some of the states.
Yes, in many of them. And we just mentioned that to say that the current concept of the separation, the wall of separation, which was in a letter that Jefferson wrote to the Danvers Baptists, that's not a part of our constitutional or historic documents as a nation. But there must be these limitations that are placed upon the society. And if you go back to Westminster, which I guess is what really the question you were asking, is that there was the great debate that took place several great debates. One of them was the Erastian position versus what finally is enshrined in the Westminster Confession, where the Erastian members of the Westminster Assembly argued for the superiority of the civil government over the church. And that was fiercely resisted by the theologians at Westminster. And so the chapter on the civil
government, sense that they would outlaw blasphemy or bad theology, or that in that role.
No. They do see a role for the civil government in that. What they don't see is the civil government having any right to
owning the building of the churches, owning the property,
and intruding on the internal government of the church.
Like the king placing bishops.
Right. So the chapter on the civil government, the opening statement is what the Parliament, in fact, never did endorse. It went up to Scotland, what is endorsed there. But Parliament never approved of the chapter on the civil government.
Which is anti-Erastian.
Anti-Erastian, it comes right out in the first paragraph and says that there is a separate ecclesiastical government from the civil government. It is independent of the civil government. That's a different question about whether or not the civilization is true.
So the Erastians would argue that when Paul explains in Romans that he gives the state the sword, that wouldn't apply to the sword being over the church, but only in civil affairs.
Yes, and it would be a difficult argument to make, I think, for the Westminster Divines, because they were called into being by the Parliament. There's the irony. So you go back to Constantine. The Nicene Creed is a product of a convention, call it, of theologians that was called together by the monarch, by the emperor, by Constantine. So there is built into whole Christian history, there is this tension. Parliament creates the Westminster Assembly, which writes the Westminster Confession of Faith, which has a chapter on civil government.
It's working in an Erastian mode, even as the document, the creed, is anti-Erastian.
Yes.
The irony there.
Yes, and so Parliament resists what the theologians want to write. They write it anyway. It never does get approved in England, but it does get approved in Scotland, and so it's been passed down to us. There was a very clear statement about the separation of the government of the church from the civil government. They are independent of each other, even though in a Christian civilization, the civil government would punish heretics and blasphemers.
Yeah. Terry, another question. How does race play into all this discussion? I think that's one of the driving fears and interests of the General Assembly, is the idea of white Christian nationalism, or the way in which race has been entangled in these Protestant social ethic, social vision before. Why is that? And what do you hope to see from the document?
I think that to introduce race is to betray the cause for which we are speaking right now.
The Christian cause, yeah.
Yeah, the race is not an issue in the New Testament. It's nullified. There's neither Greek nor Jew.
The dividing wall of separation is torn down.
It's been torn down. There are cultural differences. Those are significant. They need to be talked about. But race is not the basis for that discussion. And so race is not should not be a part, say, of membership in the church.
Right.
Or holding ecclesiastical office. These are not race-based. We don't make decisions based on race. I don't think that even in our denomination, the PCA, to which our ministers belong, I think with the whole woke movement, I think that infected even the PCA for a while. I think that there were decisions being based on who's going to be in ecclesiastical positions.
DEI, affirmative action in some ways, and are even encouraged from a General Assembly to our elders.
Yeah. It was very, very discouraging. That I think people were elected as moderator. I think people were appointed to chairmanships that were appointed purely because of their race, which I think is always a mistake. We want to be colorblind. We want a merit system. Who should be the chairman of a committee? Who should be the moderator of the General Assembly? The person that's most qualified should be that person. And it doesn't matter what their color is. It doesn't matter what their race is or their ethnicity is. We don't care about any of that. We just want qualified people.
We want character, not the color of the skin.
Right. Martin Luther King's famous statement. It's not the color of the skin, but the content of their character. That's the distinguishing mark. And so no, white nationalism is a heresy. I think communism is a heresy. Class-based division within society to extend rights and privileges to people on the basis of class. So the workers are elevated over the aristocracy. The aristocracy are put to death. I mean, that's one form of class. That's class-based bigotry. Then there's race-based bigotry. We are utterly opposed to both of those.
James said clear, no partiality.
Yes, it was at James 2. Yeah, the rich man comes in and you give him the best seat, and the poor guy comes in, you have him sit in the back. James repudiates that. Christian church should always have repudiated that. I don't think we always have. I don't think we did in the South, to be quite frank about it. It's one thing for educational distinctions and cultural distinctions. That all has to do with what a person is qualified to do. But to base it on color of skin, race, I think that's a heresy.
Yeah. Any hopes from this document? Do you hope to see anything from it? What do you think about the study committee as a whole?
I think to develop intellectuals, scholars, or probably the better word, scholars who are able to recast a vision for a Christian society and what that looks like. Because it's a very healthy and a positive one. What does it look like? Well, it looks like men marrying women and having a positive view of children and the permanence of marriage, and children being brought up in homes in which mothers and fathers love each other and the marriage is intact, and they grow up with a mom in the home and a dad in the home. That's part of the vision of a Christian society that was intact into the mid-1960s in this country. The elementary school that I went to, I remember the first student that had a divorced parent. It was that rare.
Yeah.
We had about, I think, 400 or 500 students in our elementary school.
Public school. Yeah.
Public school. One divorce.
Southern California.
And he was in my grade, and I went to his home, and I remember just feeling so uncomfortable and disoriented by the fact that the man that was living in the house was not his natural father.
Yeah.
It was unnerving for me. It was destabilizing. It just had this strange quality to me as a boy. How could that happen? And that was that rare, and that was that strange. Well, that's what a Christian civilization looks like. It's basic. The family is honored. Children are sought. The home is intact. Basic moral principles and chivalry and courtesy and human dignity is recognized, and there's you treat other people with decency. We've talked about what was wrong with the Old South. One of the things that's good about the South is that there is a custom of being kind toward people, strangers.
Hospitality.
Yes, a Southern sense of hospitality. Southern hospitality is famous. Being friendly, talking to people, asking them questions about themselves, giving them a sense of importance.
Showing honor to whom honor is due, or the honorific titles, yes ma'am, yes sir. Right.
Well, I don't know if people appreciate the extent to which that is important, that it happens in our church.
Yeah.
Not that that's Southern hospitality. I think it's Christian hospitality, and the South was affected by that more than other regions of the country. So when somebody comes into our church and we don't recognize them, we are friendly, we are kind, we are interested. We ask them about themselves. We don't just let them sit there by themselves and ignore them and let them walk in and walk out and not be greeted and not be treated kindly. So that is a different kind of society than you walk in, you've got the wrong skin color. You walk in, you're of the wrong class. You don't fit in. You're from the wrong region, and we judge you on the basis of that.
That's unchristian.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, any concluding thoughts this week, Terry, for our time into the study?
Yes, I think that we all need to be careful in the exercise of the power that is God-given and that we enjoy in this country. We all are citizens, and we vote. And that's an exercise of political power. And what we want from our leaders are people who are more rather than less Christian in their outlook. So we're not so concerned about their words. We're concerned about their policies and what they're going to do and the impact that that's going to have on marriage, on family, on schools, on the relationship between church and state. And we want people who are going to recognize the rule of law and universal rights, and not impose a structure that favors one group over another because of skin color or ethnicity or some other external superficial criteria.
Well, allow me to remind our listeners we love to receive your questions. Please email them to the address listed in the show notes. This has been Into the Study, the podcast from the Independent Presbyterian Church in Savannah, Georgia. This is Tim Shaw and Terry Johnson, hoping you found it helpful. Until next time.
Well, you heard there from Dr. Terry Johnson and Reverend Tim Shaw from the Independent Presbyterian Church in Savannah. I'm grateful to them for sharing this episode with me. Thank you for Josh Espinoza getting it ready so that we could republish it here on this feed. A fascinating conversation indeed. I'm hopeful that Dr. Johnson will be able to come on to discuss some of the ideas and the history of these points of our confession that we agree with. Look for another episode later this week with Timothy Brindle, John Orlando, Mark Robinson, and Charles Stover, where we're going to look at some of that little moment of back and forth between Timothy Brindle and Reverend Kevin DeYoung, but also where do we find our affinity in the church? Well, I'll talk to you then.